He killed his own brother for 12,000 acres and an army contract. He beat an 8-year-old girl with a silver-capped whip and called it discipline. He owned the judge, the marshal, and half the town. By every measure, Darius Cole had already won. There was just one thing he didn't count on: a drunk carpenter with a dead man's letter and nothing left to lose. This is a channel for those who believe good still wins in the end. Stories rooted in the spirit of the West, in fierce love, quiet sacrifice, and the kind of human decency that never goes out of style, no matter how dark things get. Evil is loud and powerful, right up until the moment one honest person decides to stand in its way. If justice moves you, subscribe and share, because stories like this deserve to be heard by every soul who still believes in doing what's right.
He laid her on his workbench, and the lamplight showed him the pure evil of it all. A swollen eye, a split lip, and bruises so old and new they told a terrible story. And across her back, the crisscross pattern of a horsewhip he knew all too well. Only one man in the whole territory carried a whip like that. When she came to, her one good eye was just filled with terror. He finally got a name out of her, a whisper, Emmy Cole. That name hit Caleb like a mule kick. She was the daughter of his old friend Samuel Cole, the biggest rancher around, who had died in a fall just 5 months back. When Caleb asked if her uncle did this to her, the little girl just curled into a ball, shaking like a leaf. That was all the answer he needed. As he gently cleaned her wounds, Emmy pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. It was a letter from her daddy, Samuel, speaking from the grave. He wrote that he knew his own brother, Darius, was a snake in deep debt who wanted the ranch. Samuel had a feeling his death would not be an accident, so he made a secret will that named Caleb as Emmy's guardian. He begged him, "Save her, and maybe you will save yourself too." Just as Caleb finished reading, he heard horses outside. Emmy's face went white. Peeking out, Caleb saw 2 riders, the town marshal, and right beside him, Darius Cole. Hanging from Darius's belt was that same silver-capped whip. Caleb looked at the whiskey bottle on his bench, then at the terrified child. He walked to the back door and poured every last drop out into the snow. He was done running. He stepped outside, the letter in his hand. "Marshal," he said, his voice steady as a rock. "Darius will not be taking her. Turns out I am her legal guardian." He handed the letter to the marshal, whose face got harder with every line he read. When he looked up at Darius, the law was in his eyes. The official will was found right where Samuel said it would be. Darius was arrested on the spot, his wicked plan all come to ruin. That day, Caleb Dawson did not just save a little girl's life. He found his own again, proven that the best parts of us never really die. They're just waiting for a good reason to come back. Caleb stared at the letter, his hands shaking. He looked at the little girl, Emmy, whose one good eye held no hope at all. He put the unopened whiskey bottle back on his workbench and gave her a cup of water instead. As she drank, the sound of horses outside made the cup fall and shatter. Emmy pressed herself into the darkest corner, her eyes wide with terror. Through a crack in the wall, Caleb saw Marshal Owen Briggs and the girl's uncle, Darius Cole. Darius looked like a man haunted by his own choices, wearing a fine coat with worn-out cuffs. At his hip was a riding crop with a silver handle. Caleb looked back at Emmy. She was so scared she had stopped breathing, just shaking her head in a silent plea. The whiskey bottle seemed to call his name. A small, broken sound from Emmy made up his mind. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, pulling the door shut. He was now the only thing between that little girl and the world. Darius pushed forward. "I believe you have my niece," he said, handing the marshal a document. Marshal Briggs glanced at it. "These papers seem to be in order." "The girl imagines things," Darius said smoothly. Caleb's voice was cold as iron. "I know where the marks on her back came from." Darius flinched, his hand touching the riding crop. "That's called discipline," he snapped. "She never said a word," Caleb told him, looking at the crop. "But I can see the pattern its braided leather would leave. It matches the one on your belt. Darius stepped closer, his breath stinking of whiskey. That ranch is 12,000 acres with an Army contract worth $15,000 a year. You think a drunk can stop me? Caleb's answer was quiet. I think you already murdered your brother for it. Marshal Briggs drew his pistol. That is enough. I have known you for 15 years, Caleb, but grief can make a man see things that are not there. So you think I hurt her? Caleb asked. I think I have legal papers on one side and your word on the other. I will give you 10 days to build a case, the marshal said. That is the law. Darius shouted, 10 days? On day 11, Briggs said. I will come back to do my job. He mounted his horse and left Darius staring at Caleb with pure hate in his eyes. Have you ever seen someone with nothing left to lose finally decide to fight back? This is the story of Caleb, a blacksmith who teaches us that sometimes a broken person is the only one who can make things right. Stick around to see how he saves a little girl who has no one else. As Darius left, he sneered, Enjoy your last 10 days. Caleb just barred the door and told the terrified child, You are staying right here. Emmy sank to the floor, shaking. Caleb gently offered her an old wool blanket. She took it with a bruised hand. Thank you, she whispered. Do not thank me yet, he said. We have 10 days and I have got $9. Emmy pulled the blanket closer. Papa said you would help. He said there is a will inside his old saddle. It names me the owner, and you as my guardian. Emmy held up 2 fingers, showing him there were 2 guards at the ranch. She then made a motion to show they changed at sunset, leaving just 1. A small smile touched Caleb's face. Then Emmy pointed to the whiskey bottle on his bench and shook her head. Without a word, Caleb walked out back and poured every last drop onto the snow, setting the empty bottle on a shelf as a reminder of his promise. He pointed Emmy to the back room where she could lock the door. She held up 10 fingers, 10 days. That was all he had. Caleb read her father's letter again, the words of fire in his gut. A dead man's wish, $9, and a reputation as a town drunk were all he had against Darius Cole. He listened to the little girl's trusting breath from the other room. 10 days. That was all the time he had to find the will and face a killer. For the first time in 2,555 days, Caleb had a purpose again. The whiskey bottle on the shelf stayed sealed. When Emmy came out, her gaze shot straight to the whiskey bottle. Still empty, Caleb told her. And it is going to stay that way. He poured her some coffee, then said she needed a doctor. Fear flashed in her eyes. He will tell Uncle Darius, she whispered. Not Hosea Crane, Caleb promised. He is a good man. At a knock on the door, 8-year-old Emmy flattened herself against the wall, expecting a blow, but it was just Doc Hosea Crane. Marshall sent me, the doctor said, about Samuel Cole's girl. His professional manner fell away when he saw Emmy huddled there. In a quiet voice, he said, Come here, child. Let old Doc Crane have a look. The doctor knelt, promising not to do a thing without her say-so. She finally placed her small hand in his. When he saw the wounds on her back, the room went silent. With hands steady from 30 years of practice, he cleaned each one. The infections are bad, he finally said, his voice thick. They need cleaning twice a day. Emmy held up 3 fingers when the doctor asked when she had last eaten. He then told Caleb quietly, Those marks are from a leather quirt, just like the one Darius Cole carries. The doctor wrote it all down, a formal medical report. Then came the hard truth. He knew Darius had murdered Samuel but was blackmailed into silence. I stayed quiet to save my own skin, Crane admitted, his voice full of shame. And this child paid the price. He apologized to Emmy, and to his surprise, the little girl patted his hand in forgiveness. As he left, he warned Caleb, Move fast. Darius is already turning the town against you. The doctor cried, Emmy whispered after he left. Another knock brought Nettie Hargrove, whose own husband was killed in one of Darius Cole's accidents. She came bearing food and clothes for Emmy, but she also brought something more. Samuel Cole's journal, found hidden in an old coat. Nettie's face, hardened by loss, softened when she saw Emmy. Her boy, Willie, did not waste any time. He just walked up and offered Emmy a shiny red apple, and the little girl took a big bite. And then Emmy spoke for the first time, asking the boy about his dog. The three small words were a miracle. She even mentioned her own cat, Copper. When Willie asked what happened to it, she went quiet, so he just started telling her funny stories about his own dog. Nettie pulled Caleb aside. "You know Darius Cole owns this town," she said, her voice low. "He is the one who killed my husband." She had stayed quiet for her son's sake, but not anymore. Caleb told her he was going to the ranch that night to get the will. "I will stay with her," Nettie said. Willie, too." With $9 to his name and a foreclosure notice on his bench, Caleb grabbed his tools. The shop did not matter. Only keeping Emmy safe did. Later, Willie finally got her to eat some bread and cheese. By afternoon, Emmy was wearing a clean dress and talking quietly to Willie about animals. It was a good start. When the sun went down, Caleb put on his coat to leave, and Emmy's sharp eyes watched his every move. Emmy pointed to the door, then to herself. Caleb said no, but she insisted, whispering exactly where the item was hidden. He argued it was too dangerous. She just showed him a fresh mark on her neck. "Stay close," he finally agreed. Nettie chambered around in her shotgun. "You bring her back safe." This story is about doing what is right, even when it is hard, and how the smallest folks can have the biggest hearts. 8-year-old Emmy walked 15 miles back to the place that hurt her, all on the word of her dead father. She was the bravest soul Caleb had ever seen. After walking for 2 hours, Emmy's small, cold hand found his. It almost buckled his knees, reminding him of the daughter he had lost. But this little girl's hand was real, and it was trusting him. So Caleb pushed down the grief, held on tight, and they walked on into the dark. When they got to the ranch, Emmy pointed past the trees. A single guard, a fellow named Virgil, stood by the dark barn. She whispered he was mean but too lazy to move from that door. With the other guard in town, this was their moment. Caleb took a pry bar to a small back door, and the lock popped like a gunshot. They froze when they heard boots stomping around to see what made the noise. Caleb pushed Emmy inside and pulled the door shut just as a lantern light swung by. The barn smelled like hay and fear. Emmy pulled him behind a stall right as Virgil came around the corner, but her boot kicked a bucket, and the sound rang out. Virgil spun around, his hand going for his gun, but Caleb was already moving. He crossed the floor in a flash and laid Virgil out cold with one punch. Caleb snatched the lantern before it could set the barn ablaze. Emmy, her face hard with purpose, brought him a rope. They tied up Virgil and stuffed him in an empty stall. She then showed Caleb an old saddle in the tack room. Just as her daddy's letter promised, Caleb found a secret seam and pulled out the will. He read the most important lines out loud. He, Caleb James Dawson, was now the legal guardian for Emmeline Rose Cole. All the property was to be held for her. The document was filed 5 months before Darius faked his own papers. "It's real," Caleb said. Emmy slumped to the floor, overcome with relief. Then she pulled out a small, water-damaged book. It was her father's journal. Inside, Caleb found a map of murder. Page after page told how Darius had threatened and killed folks to get their land for pennies on the dollar. The last entry was the most damning. It said if anything happened to him, Darius was behind it. Now they had the proof they needed. The final entry in that journal hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. It said, Darius Cole was a desperate man who would not take no for an answer. He wrote, "I am putting this in God's hands, and Caleb Dawson's." The little book trembled in Caleb's hands. Just then he heard horses closing in fast. Caleb shoved the will and journal in his coat, grabbed Emmy, and they ran for the back door and his horse. 2 shots whizzed past their ears as they galloped into the night. They rode hard and made it back to the shop. His friend Nettie sat on the porch, a shotgun resting on her lap. "Took you long enough," she said. Inside, a hound dog named Biscuit greeted Emmy, who hugged the animal tight, finally feeling safe. But Caleb knew their fight was not over. The will was just paper because Darius had the local judge in his pocket. That will meant nothing without an honest lawyer, and Darius had the town stirred up against them. They had maybe 3 days before he came with force. Caleb had to ride a hard 80 miles to Cheyenne to find a lawyer named Phineas Ward. He looked at 8-year-old Emmy, asleep with her dog. This was about keeping a promise to a child who had seen too much, and about one good man standing up to evil. Emmy woke before he left and pointed at the whiskey bottle on his bench. "Promise," she said, her voice small but firm. "I promise," Caleb swore. "Not another drop." She then made him promise he would come back. He knelt down and looked her in the eye. "I'm not your papa, Emmy, but I swear I'll come back." She then wrapped her arms around his neck, and Caleb hugged her back, the first time he had held anyone in 7 years. 2 days later, Caleb rode in with the lawyer, Phineas Ward. Nettie was on the porch, her shotgun still across her lap next to a fresh buckshot pattern in the doorframe. "Darius came last night with 8 men, she said. "Threatened to burn us all." Caleb's blood ran cold. Just then, Darius and his men returned. Caleb stood in their way, and when one of them drew on Emmy, he threw himself in front of her and took a bullet in the shoulder. Have you ever met a man pushed so far he had no choice but to push back? That was Caleb Dawson. At 57 years old, he rode into a hard winter with a promise to keep. The 18-hour ride to Cheyenne was agony, a fight against his old demons every single mile. But the memory of that little girl's hug was all he needed to stay sober and keep going. This was about saving a life, and a little pain was not about to stop him. Caleb finally made it to Cheyenne and found the law office of Phineas Ward, but it was all locked up. A man next door said some rough characters had come by 2 months ago, and Ward had been hiding out ever since. He pointed Caleb to the Plainsman Hotel, room 12. At the hotel, the clerk gave him a sour look but saw the desperation in Caleb's eyes and slid him the key. Caleb knocked on the door of room 12. A tired voice from inside told him to go away. Caleb said he was a friend of Samuel Cole. The door creaked open, revealing Phineas Ward, a man who looked like he had given up on the world. "Samuel is dead," Ward whispered. Caleb looked him right in the eye. "I know. But his daughter Emmy is alive, and her uncle is a monster." Ward's face went pale. "You're the carpenter," he said. "I also have Samuel's journal," Caleb told him. "It proves Darius is a killer. All they needed was a lawyer with enough grit to do what was right." Ward confessed Darius's men had threatened him, so he ran and hid. Caleb pulled out the will. "Being scared just means you know what you are fighting," he said. "This document right here makes you Emmy's guardian. It makes everything Darius has done illegal." For a long minute, Phineas Ward just stood there, torn between fear and duty. Then he straightened up and opened the door wide. He said the clerk's office closed in 90 minutes, and it was time to move. They hurried through the streets. Ward was a new man. He burst into the clerk's office and used the law like a weapon, forcing the young clerk to accept their emergency filing. With only moments left, Ward filed everything: the will, the doctor's report on Emmy's bruises, and Samuel's journal. The clerk stamped every page, making it official law. Outside, Caleb felt he could finally take a real breath. The ruling would come in 3 days. Ward then declared he was done running. He was riding back to Black Hollow with Caleb to face whatever came their way. But they did not have 3 days. A telegram from the doctor said Darius had attacked with 8 men and was coming back for more. Caleb was on his horse in 10 minutes. He rode for 16 hours straight through the cold, ignoring the pain. When he finally reached Black Hollow, he was more dead than alive, but he saw his friend Nettie on the porch with a rifle. The fight had just begun. Caleb lay bleeding on the frozen dirt as the lawyer, Phineas Ward, stepped forward. "It is over, Darius. Your brother wrote everything down. Your hired man is ready to testify." Just like that, Darius Cole's fight was done. As they put him in cuffs, Emmy knelt by Caleb. "You took a bullet for me," she cried. "Told you," Caleb whispered. "I keep my promises." Back at the ranch that was now hers, he watched her hug her cat and finally felt like he was home. "You promised," Emmy said, looking him over. "I feel worse than I look," Caleb admitted. "But I am here." The lawyer, Phineas Ward, stepped inside and knelt. "Miss Cole, I wrote your daddy's will, and I am sorry I was not here sooner. It is now with the governor. In 72 hours, your uncle will not be able to touch you." Emmy looked at the lawyer. "Papa trusted you. Do not prove him wrong." Later, the doctor's wife, Nettie, stood by the window with her shotgun. "We might not have that long," she warned. "Darius has been in the saloon all morning buying drinks and telling lies. He says you are a dangerous man and he is just a concerned uncle. He has got about 20 men ready to follow him." "He told them the 10 days are up," Nettie said. Caleb looked at the lawyer, who just shook his head. "The local judge works for Darius. All we can do is hold on." "I am staying," the doctor said. "Me too," Nettie added, chambering around. Her 12-year-old son, Willie, then spoke up from the floor. "I am staying too." Nettie whispered, "Lord, help us." Emmy's voice was quiet. "Mr. Dawson, if they come, do not let him take me back alive." The room fell silent. Caleb knelt in front of her. "Listen to me. No one is taking you anywhere. I made a promise." Her one good eye searched his face. "What if you cannot stop them? Then I will die in that doorway. But the law is coming, Emmy. We just have to hold on until it gets here." It was a story about how one good man can remind a whole town of its soul. It started when Darius Cole and 23 of his hired guns came at sundown, their torches lighting up the whole street. He yelled for Caleb Dawson, a simple carpenter, to hand over the little girl he was protecting. But Caleb just stepped onto his porch with an old revolver ready to stand against all of them, because sometimes that is all a man can do. Marshal Briggs, the lawman, stepped up with a warrant saying he did not want to use it. Caleb, steady as a rock, asked him a simple question. Did he bother to check the date on those papers? Darius had filed his claim 2 weeks after the girl's daddy died, but her father's true will, Naaman Caleb Guardian, was filed 5 months before that. The whole town heard it, and they knew a legal will beats a greedy man's paper every time. Darius bellowed that it was a lie, but Caleb didn't flinch. He just offered a deal. 1 day. 1 day for the governor to see the proper will. If the governor sided with Darius, Caleb would hand the girl over himself. When the marshal hesitated, Darius made his big mistake. He yelled, "That is not what I am paying you for." And just like that, the whole town knew the law had been bought. Right then, Doc Crane came out holding a medical report. He declared that the girl's daddy didn't just fall, he was murdered. Then, his voice heavy, he told the crowd that little Emmy had 47 welts on her back. 3 of them, he said, were a perfect match for the silver-capped whip that Darius Cole wore on his belt. The crowd's murmur turned into a low growl. That broke the dam. One by one, folks started recalling strange fires and broken ladders, little tragedies that always ended with Darius getting richer. He was losing the crowd and started yelling, but a small, clear voice cut through his panic. "Enough!" It was little Emmy. The 8-year-old child walked past Caleb and straight into the middle of all those angry men. She stood before them, a small barefoot girl on the frozen ground. Then she turned her back to the crowd and pulled down the collar of her dress. The torchlight showed every cruel mark. The street went dead silent. A big rancher named Henderson pushed forward, took off his own heavy coat, and wrapped it around her. "We are so sorry, child," he said, his voice choked with shame. Darius was still yelling about his rights when the marshal finally found his spine. "A judge you paid," he said, his voice cold as a stone. Then a lawyer stepped out of the shadows with the official will, proving Darius's papers were worthless. In that moment, Darius Cole stood completely alone, his paid men melting away into the night. Like a cornered animal, Darius pulled a pistol and aimed it straight at Emmy. Caleb launched himself off the porch, covering the girl with his body just as a shot exploded, tearing through his shoulder. But a second shot followed right behind it. The marshal had fired. Darius dropped, and the fight was over. Caleb's only thought was for the girl. "Emmy, are you hurt?" he asked, and her small voice answered, "No." While Doc Crane was pressing down on the wound, telling him it went clean through, Emmy held his hand tight. For the first time, tears were streaming down her face. "You took a bullet for me," she whispered. "Told you I keep my promises," Caleb grunted. He watched the marshal lead a handcuffed Darius right past them. "You cannot prove a thing," Darius sneered. The lawyer just shook his head. "We already have. Your own brother documented every crooked deal you ever made." As they hauled him off to jail, the town watched in a silence that was louder than any cheer. Back inside, Crane patched Caleb up, with Emmy never leaving his side. "Have you ever seen a real wrong made right? This story is about just that, how a good man, hollowed out by grief, and a little girl tougher than a $2 steak, stared down pure evil and won. It is about a promise kept against all odds. That night, after the fight, a telegraph boy finally showed up. The governor had sided with them. Samuel Cole's will was good as gold. Caleb Dawson was now Emmeline Rose Cole's guardian. Her uncle Darius was left with nothing. Emmy looked at Caleb all busted up and whispered, "We won." And Lord, he smiled for the first time in 7 long years. It took 3 days for Doc Crane to let Caleb on his feet. Emmy, with her dog Biscuit, brought him coffee every single morning. She just sat with him, a quiet little comfort. One day she said, "You got shot." Then she looked him square in the eye. "Not for me." For the first time, Caleb saw the bruises on her face were fading. She looked like what she was, just a little 8-year-old girl, her feet not even touching the floor. She told him the marshal had caught the man who wrecked her papa's wagon. Said her Uncle Darius paid him $50 to do it. She said Briggs, the lawman, told her Darius was going to trial for everything, even what happened to her folks. Emmy stroked her dog's head for a long while. "I thought I would feel glad," she said, her voice soft. "But I just feel tired." Caleb nodded. "That happens when you have been carrying too much for too long. Your insides just need a rest." The day Caleb walked out of the doc's office, his arm in a sling, the lawyer, Ward, was waiting. Back at Caleb's shop, Ward laid out the papers. "It is all official," he said. "Caleb, you are her guardian. The ranch and everything on it goes into a trust for Emmy until she is 18. And you are the man in charge," Ward went on. "As for Darius, the court froze everything he owns. They are looking into all his crooked deals." Then Caleb had to ask about the past due notice from the bank for his shop, for $175. Ward smiled a little. "Funny thing. Darius owned a big chunk of that bank. To get clear of a man like that, the board decided to just wipe your debt clean. The weight was just gone. The shop was his." But Caleb looked right at Emmy and shook his head. "I do not need the shop," he said. "I need the ranch, if that is all right with you." The little girl sized him up one last time, then gave a small nod. "It is your home too," she said. 2 weeks later, they moved to the Cole Ranch. They were finally going home. Walking into that ranch house felt like breathing again after 7 years. It was just as Samuel had left it. Then Emmy stopped cold. "Copper," she whispered. "My cat. They would not let me bring him." They found that orange cat 2 days later up in the hayloft. When Emmy called his name, he came right down. She just held him and cried, not from hurt, but from pure relief. Good folks came to help put the ranch back together, people who owed Samuel's memory a debt of kindness. Nettie and her boy Willie moved out, filling the quiet place with life and laughter. Caleb started teaching Emmy how to work with wood. He was a tough teacher. "Wood does not forgive mistakes," he would say. She would get frustrated, but she always sanded it down and started again. That first birdhouse she built was all crooked, but Emmy put it right on the porch. She said, "A bird just needs a home. It does not care if it is a little bent." Then she turned and gave Caleb a real smile, the first he had ever seen from her. It was about the prettiest thing he had ever witnessed. 6 months on, Caleb drove his truck to the cemetery overlooking the valley. Standing before 2 headstones, he spoke to his wife and daughter. "I met someone," he said softly. "She is a little girl, just turned 9. I built her a bookshelf for her birthday. Caleb put his good hand on Ruth's headstone while the other, still stiff and weak, rested on his leg. He spoke quietly to his late wife. "Her name is Emmy. She is Samuel Cole's little girl. You remember Samuel, right? Well, his own brother took everything and hurt that child for 5 long months." Caleb's throat got tight. "When she knocked on my door in a blizzard, barefoot and bleeding, something I thought was gone forever woke up in me." He looked at Abigail's small stone. "Emmy is not a replacement. Nobody could ever replace you two. But she needed a hand. And for the first time in 7 years, Ruth, I said yes. I poured out every drop of whiskey that night and have not touched it since. It is the longest I have been clear-headed since you both left me." At 57 years old, his whole body ached. "I could not save you," he whispered to them. "I was 40 yards away and I could not do a thing. I have spent 7 years just dying from it. But I saved her. I saved Emmy. It does not fix what is broken, but it is something." He put on his hat. "I love you both," he said, "but I am done dying, Ruth. It is time to live." Back at the ranch, a warm light glowed from the window. He could see Emmy inside, doing her schoolwork. That little girl knew sorrow, so she had a respect for it in others. Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table in her father's old chair. The mother's chair stayed empty. Some places are meant to be honored. Emmy pushed a piece of paper to him. "I cannot figure this one out." It was long division. Caleb tried, but the numbers swam. "You cannot do it either, can you?" she said, a little smile on her face. "I am a carpenter," he admitted. "I measure things, I do not divide them." A quiet little laugh passed between them, the kind shared by folks who have been through the fire and made it out. Later that night, Emmy closed her book. "Mr. Dawson, I used to have nightmares about my uncle every single night." She paused. "I have not had one in 3 weeks." Caleb waited. "Now, I dream about Mama and Papa. Good dreams. And sometimes," she said, glancing at the empty chair, "you are there with us. And it feels like how it is supposed to be." Caleb could not speak. His throat was too tight. "Good night, Mr. Dawson." "Good night, Emmy." He listened to her footsteps go up the stairs, the house settling into the kind of quiet that means a child is safe. He checked the locks and tended the fire, doing the little things a man does when he has something precious to protect. On the front door hung a horseshoe they had made together. Under it she had carved the words, "Built on promise, kept by love." He stepped outside. The same old stars had watched him for 7 empty years. But from this porch, somehow, they looked brand new. Later that night, Caleb looked in on Emmy. Her door was open just a crack, the way she liked it now. Not locked tight out of fear, but open just enough to feel safe. He was living in another man's house, but it was finally starting to feel like home again. A new family, made from 2 broken ones, was beginning to heal. Emmy had insisted he take her parents' bedroom. Caleb sat on the bed and looked at his hands. One was scarred from a life of hard work. The other was wounded from saving a child. He was raising another man's daughter in another man's house, but he was keeping the promises that mattered most. Life on that 1,200-acre ranch was ordinary, filled with chores and Emmy's slowly improving coffee. It was the exact kind of ordinary he thought he had lost forever. It gave him a reason to get up in the morning. And for the first time in a long, long while, Caleb Dawson closed his eyes and slept like a man who had fought his battle and finally found his way home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.